Let's go ahead and start with some prayers. So let me pull up the prayers that I think are usually done on Wednesday, according to what Venerable Dundrup said. The praise to Shakyamuni Buddha. Instead of doing this 3 times, let's just do this once tonight, and then we'll do the mandala offering as well as the refuge and bodhicitta prayer. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Let's do again the short mandala offering. We'll just do this in English tonight. Remember, this is kind of making a vast pure offering, imagining the entire phenomenal world being transformed into kind of a beautiful paradise, a Buddha field. And we're making this perfect offering, this pure offering, so we can receive the blessings to achieve the realizations on the path that we're going to be talking about tonight in regard to the Lamrim. So let's go ahead and recite that together. This ground anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Hidam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryata Yami. And refuge we'll do first in English, then twice chanting the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyapsu chi daki chunyen gipe sanam gi dola penche sangye dupar shok sangye chodang soki choknam la Jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyen gipe sanam gi dola penche sangye duparsho. All right, let's do a short meditation to set our motivation for our time together tonight. So we'll spend the first few minutes, as usual, just focusing on the breath, trying to calm our minds a bit, as well as to heighten our awareness, our focus. So just using the breath as a meditation object in whichever way you prefer. Try to keep your awareness there very vividly. And then when the mind does wander, guide the mind gently back to the breath. Do this in silence for just a few minutes, and then I'll lead you in setting our motivation of bodhicitta for our time together. So before we set our motivation, just briefly reflect on how, even in our conventional world, we need to have some guidance, some direction as to where we want to go. If we were leaving, wherever it is that you reside, heading out to, a trip several hundred miles away, if you had no idea where you were going, it's doubtful that you would end up at your destination. And we know this from just dealing with navigating things in our everyday world. And of course, now we have GPS and other tools that can help us, that can guide us. Well, what we're embarking on and what we're looking at tonight is sort of the GPS for the Buddhist path, the Lamrim. So before we set our motivation, you might even recall the first time you encountered those words, Lamrim, the stages of the path, the gradual path. And if you were like me, it came as some relief to know that the entire structure of how we are to proceed on our path is already laid out for us. We don't have to guess it. We don't have to try to figure it out. It's all there, very clearly delineated, a path that every bodhisattva of the past has followed, a path that every Buddha has completed. So just feel very grateful that you've encountered these teachings that give you the absolute best instruction about how to achieve your greatest potential and help others to do the same. And then we set our motivation on the basis of that. We're here so that we can accomplish this path. We can gradually develop our minds from our unenlightened state we're dealing with currently to the state of a Buddha, a being who has fully awakened, who has removed everything that is negative and developed everything which is positive to a limitless degree. And we do this so we can benefit others, so we can lead them on that path of awakening and hold that motivation of bodhicitta, that wish to become a Buddha for the sake of all beings. That is the sole purpose for everything we're looking at tonight in regard to the Lamrim. When you're ready, you can open your eyes fully and we'll start. So in regard to that idea I brought into the meditation about when you first encountered the Lamrim, I remember myself, I started practicing Tibetan Buddhism in 1993, roughly. I started reading, went on a retreat with Sogyal Rinpoche, who was the head of an organization called Rigpa. Some of you may have heard of Sogyal Rinpoche in his book, The Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. There was some structure I was given in regard to that book and at the retreat, but it really was still pretty vague. I remember when I first encountered the FPMT, our center in San Francisco, Sechenling, and they showed me a book. It was, of course, the copy. They didn't have a soft cover copy at that time of the Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand by Pabanka Rinpoche. It was that big hardbound book. And I look at it and I go, oh, wow, this is like telling me all of this, like, again, where to go, what to practice next. It was very, very clear. There was this kind of sense of joy I had upon finding something that was actually giving me much greater direction and information to work with in terms of what I was doing on the Buddhist path. Prior to that, it was like, oh, I'll meditate on this and oh, I'll meditate on that. And oh, that looks good. And really no real direction. So I don't know if anyone wants to share any of their experiences around what it was like to encounter the Lamrim for you, but I'll invite anyone online or here in the Gompa if you'd like to, before we get started on what I've prepared for tonight. Anyone? We've got the microphone ready, yes, in case anyone here in the Gompa. No one online? Anyway, perhaps, yeah, Rachel's going to share. Wonderful, Rachel. It's good to see you. I keep thinking I have to call you because now school's almost in session, so you're probably back
Kids
teaching mode, but anyway.
Kids come on Friday. Let's see. How do I do this without echo? So the I don't know when the first time is, but what the time that really stuck was when Yangtze Rinpoche in Scottsdale, Arizona, was asked to give a talk in the living room, Jan Rydell.
Oh, wow.
And the way that Yangtze Rinpoche presented the Lamrim, I think I had already been to Copa and I'd already done a whole month-long retreat in the Lamrim. But there was something that just went, oh, everything, all the rigpas, all the, all the different lineages and everything could come together within that path. There was nothing that had to be like sectioned out of the long rip. It really was
complete. Yeah.
It was Yangtze Rinpoche's presentation.
Well, I don't know if I can live up to Yangtze Rinpoche's presentation, but thank you for sharing that, though. It sounds so inspiring. I wonder if it was recorded. Probably not in someone's living room. So, anyone else? Thank you, Rachel. That was great. Yeah, Barbara, looks like you're online with your hand up. Please unmute and we'll hopefully hear you here.
Hi again, Don. The first time I ever heard that term was at the November course at Copan. And I had the fortune and the karma to have Venerable Rabina be the teacher, and she went through it twice.
Oh, wow.
So it was amazing, absolutely amazing.
Good, good. Yeah, I mean, with Venerable Rabina speaking, she can go through it twice probably pretty quickly, the way she talks. Some people have compared my speaking to hers, but I think I don't hold a candle to her speed, but or her teaching for that matter. But
well, and the thing
let's
for
go
me,
ahead and talk about the Lamrim. I want to introduce the Tibetan letters for this. I didn't put this into my slides, but just so you know, this is actually lamrim.com, but the com is really more like gom. So I don't know why they have it. But the two words at the top, these are Tibetan letters. You have la and then mas, and that makes lam, because the default in Tibetan letters is the ah sound. So lam, that means path. And then that other character that's next to it with the little squirrely thing on top, that's a ra with a ma. So that gets changed from ram to a rim because the curly Q on the top is what makes it into an I sound. So anyway, that's just a little bit of Tibetan for you. Lam rim, again, rim has the connotation of being kind of stages or gradual. So what we're going to be talking about tonight is this idea that was formulated, and I'll give you kind of the history of it to some degree, what sort of, where this all came from. Why do we have this Lamrim tradition, especially in this branch of Tibetan Buddhism that we study here? And the implication is that, again, we have everything set out in a path. And path, it's an evocative term, right? You know, you'd go, where's the path? You know, where do you follow? It's not a physical path, obviously. Path means our minds, our consciousness, that we are changing, moving gradually on a path of progression. And so it's a really wonderful, amazing teaching that I'm hoping you feel somewhat inspired. I have to admit, I have a little bit of an agenda for presenting this. I talked to Venerable Dundrup when I found out Geshe Sherab wasn't going to be here and that I was being invited to speak. I said, well, at this point, we are planning to do the Middle-Length Lamrim course. It's part of the FPMT standard program of the basic program. Basic not meaning basic at, introductory, but basic meaning basic texts that we should all study in this tradition. I'm going to be starting that in November after Geshe Sherab leaves on Wednesday nights. So know that that'll be happening. And I'm doing it not as an advertisement because I'm not publicizing myself. I really want to encourage people to study this. It's a wonderful text. This is an amazing example of it. And again, I'll go into more detail about the history of that text as well, why we study that one in particular. So the Lamrim is a very important part of our tradition, but it also, of course, plays a role in regard to the other Buddhist traditions that came out of the dissemination of the Buddha Dharma into Tibet beginning with the oldest one, the Nyingma tradition, then the Kagyu tradition, that's about 1,000 years ago, the Sakya tradition that was shortly after that, and then our tradition, the Geluk tradition, which is the tradition of Lama Tsongkhapa, again, who composed the text that we're going to be studying in November. So let me go ahead and do my little dog and pony show here or whatever and fill you in on some things about it. I hope tonight doesn't become dry in any way. I was really quite excited putting this together. I've never really done a presentation on sort of what the Lamrim is about without going into the Lamrim in great detail. We'll talk about it a bit tonight, obviously, but the subtitle for this I call is Knowing Where We're Going and How to Get There. As I said in the meditation, that's really important that we know kind of where we're headed and how we'll actually make our way there. I'm going to start with a wonderful quote from Lama Zopa Rinpoche. I didn't find where this was from, what teaching this was from, but he says the whole idea of meditating, reading, studying Dharma, all the essence is to actualize the Lamrim path, the path to enlightenment, so that you can achieve enlightenment quicker. And then you can free the sentient beings from the oceans of samsaric suffering quicker and bring them to enlightenment quicker. That should be your main goal or aim, your purpose in life. So again, everything revolves around what Rinpoche is saying here. When we talk about Lamrim, sometimes it's an abbreviation of Jangchup Lamrim. Jangchup means enlightenment. So it's the stages of the path to enlightenment. And by enlightenment, that term is used even in Western culture with a variety of meanings. We mean the state of Buddhahood, the state that is the fulfillment of our true potential, and no goal beyond that. When you attain Buddhahood, it's actually called the path of no more learning. There's no more learning at that point. You don't have to do anything more. You just are this enlightened essence in our world that enlightens other beings, helps them on their path. So this is the goal of the Lamrim that Rinpoche is setting out there, and just gives us, again, our navigation for the first part, knowing where we're going. Where we're going is to that state of enlightenment, to the state of complete Buddhahood. It's not the only goal that the Buddha taught, but it is the final goal, the ultimate goal for us and for all beings. So in tonight's talk, I want to talk about 5 things. The first, of course, these first 3 go in somewhat chronological order. The Buddha, who lived, some 2,500 years ago. Lama Atisha, who was the founder, in a sense, of what's known as the genre of Lamrim. And then Lama Tsongkhapa, the Tibetan master, again, whose tradition we practice here. Talk a little bit about the 18 Lamrim commentaries. I'm not going to go into great detail on them. And then the particular significance of Lama Tsongkhapa's Middle-Length Treatise on the Stages of the Path to Enlightenment. Again, that's the book that we're going to be studying in November. It's going to take a while. I just might give you a forewarning on that. It's not like a 3 or 4 week course by any means. It'll probably take over a year to go through this text because it is quite an involved text, particularly the latter part of it, which we'll touch on a little bit tonight. Most of you are familiar with the Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha. These are some dates for the Buddha, but again, the dates are not really defined because keeping track of time back then was not quite as detailed as it is now. But roughly from 563 before the Common Era to 483, he lived for 80 years. Essentially, he did his initial teaching at the age of roughly 29, 30, I guess it was, no, 35, sorry, 35, when he had initially he had left the walls of the palace being a young prince and had gone on his spiritual quest at the age of 29. Some 6 years later was when he attained enlightenment. And a few weeks after that, he gave his initial teaching on the Four Noble Truths, which is, in a sense, one other structure that the Buddha gave that is incorporated into the Lamrim. But it really is such a core teaching. I wanted to mention it as part of just introducing the Buddha. But he went on from there to teach for the remaining 45 years of his life. When you compare it to some, I grew up Catholic, and of course, Jesus Christ, they say, only really had like 3 years of teaching others, giving his teachings. And if you look at the New Testament, there's really not that much that are the actual words of Jesus, right? It's pretty limited, very few. The Buddha taught extensively, and he taught in a variety of settings for 45 years. So again, there's a lot of what are called the sutras, which are the more common discourses the Buddha gave, as well as even the tantric teachings that we use in Tibetan Buddhism in particular as a means to attain enlightenment even more quickly for the benefit of others. In terms of his teachings, it is said that the Buddha gave 84,000 teachings to counter the 84,000 afflictions of beings. And by this, we don't mean there's 84,000 unique afflictions. They are just gradations of the variety of afflictions that we all know of, rooted in, the three poisons that we often talk about of attachment, anger, and ignorance. Nonetheless, this is giving just some numbers to an idea of what the Buddha taught. Regardless of the exact number, the Buddha did give many diverse teachings on many subjects, making it challenging for an individual practitioner to know specifically how to practice them. I mean, especially if we look at us who know English as our primary language, right? It's very hard to even have translations of most of these texts that the Buddha taught. In terms of the sutras, I might mention again that there was a dissemination of the Buddha's teachings into sort of Southeast Asia in what's called the Pali Canon. The Pali language was the first written language of the Buddha's teachings. And then later was a dissemination of the Sanskrit teachings, those in the Sanskrit language. And they kind of went two different directions, to the southeast with the Pali tradition and sort of to the north and east in regard to like China, Japan, Tibet, what have you, in regard to the Sanskrit tradition. But essentially, this is a lot of the words of the Buddha to digest. If you were to try to spend your life going through everything that the Buddha taught, even if you could get your hands on English translations of all these things, or learn Sanskrit and try to read them all in the Sanskrit or in the languages that they've been translated into, Chinese, Tibetan, what have you, you'd have an awful lot of reading to do before you even got around to meditating and practicing these teachings. So this is one of the great important features of the Lamrim, is it takes everything the Buddha taught and consolidates it into an amazing form. We'll see that as we go through the lecture tonight. The teachings essentially encompass two different branches, and these are parallel to some degree to what I just said in terms of the two major disseminations of the Buddha's teachings after he passed away. In the Pali language was the teachings primarily of what I like to call the individual vehicle. This is what Robert Thurman often calls it. In Sanskrit, it's Hinayana. This is mainly practiced by those called hearers, Shravakas in the Sanskrit, and solitary realizers, Pratyeka Buddhas. These are two different types of practitioners who have that aspiration to attain their own liberation. The Buddha did teach a path where you could attain your own freedom from samsara being cyclic existence, this conditioned existence we're all caught up in since beginningless time. And the state we attain is nirvana, the peace where we have put an end to being under the control of the factors that kept us bound in that state. So that we have kind of the Buddha giving this very profound set of teachings to lead beings to that result. He also, of course, taught the universal vehicle, the Mahayana, which are mainly the Sanskrit teachings, right? Mainly practiced by bodhisattvas who aspire to attain complete enlightenment or Buddhahood. There shouldn't be a hyphen there. I think I must have had it kind of formatted differently earlier. So anyway, the idea is that we have these two major branches of the Buddha's teachings that do have two different goals. Again, I'm using that loosely because we can't really tell what an individual practitioner is up to, really, when it comes down to it. Anybody practicing Buddhism could be on a path simply to using Buddhism for their own well-being in this life. They could also be looking at future lives. They could also be looking at liberation. They could also be looking at Buddhahood. There's different goals that they could be, using in terms of motivating their own practice. Obviously, once more, what we're going to be talking about tonight is the goal of the universal vehicle, the Mahayana, to attain Buddhahood. And so what we're looking at in terms of the Lamrim is the structure that encompasses all of those teachings, essentially. I mean, not every single one of them, but obviously the main teachings that are absolutely necessary for us to proceed on the path to enlightenment. So we're not looking solely at the universal vehicle, though it does encompass many of the teachings in the individual vehicle, but we're using the entire corpus of the Buddha's teachings to kind of call out what is not essential for us to know and reduce it to what is most vital for us to be able to attain enlightenment. I might go ahead and mention that on that second bullet point at the bottom there, the universal vehicle, the Mahayana itself, consists of the perfection vehicle, what's often called the Paramitayana, and the Tantra vehicle, the Vajrayana. The Tantra vehicle, again, many of you have been coming here on Wednesday nights for the teachings with Geshe-la and Yamantaka practice. That's a tantric practice. It is kind of a subset of the Mahayana because it's a specific technique that the Buddha taught through the tantras, these teachings, again, that were more hidden, more esoteric. And so that those esoteric teachings are what support someone practicing this very profound path of Tantra. The Lamrim usually doesn't deal with Tantra, just so you know. It's sometimes just like a little footnote at the tail end of the Lamrim. Lama Tsongkhapa himself, as we'll see, he composed a lot of different discourses, but he essentially composed an entire stages of the path for Tantra as well. So just know that primarily what we are looking at, if we go back to that slide in terms of the Lamrim, this will become clearer again as I go through the remainder of my slides here, is everything that is encompassed in both the individual vehicle and the universal vehicle up through the end of the perfection vehicle, essentially. I mean, those teachings that really do deal with the more, again, those are the exoteric, the more general common teachings that the Buddha gave. The esoteric teachings of Tantra are not taught generally in the Lamrim. Nonetheless, you need to practice the Lamrim well to engage in Tantra. So that's the whole point of this, is that we're really looking at what are the teachings we need to have in a more common grounding so we can achieve enlightenment primarily through the use of the tantric vehicle, the teachings that the Buddha gave to help us to accomplish enlightenment quickly. That's a real brief overview of what the Buddha taught. There's many other ways of talking about what the Buddha taught, but I'm not going to go into those as much tonight because I'm primarily going around these two more ultimate goals that are there on the screen. Those who aspire to attain their own liberation and those who aspire to attain complete Buddhahood. Because we're going to see that those are two of the subdivisions of really what we're looking at in terms of the presentation and the Lamrim. Okay, so the Buddha taught these, teachings some 2,600 years ago. They were, of course, very extensive in India, the land where he began teaching the Dharma. Of course, the Buddhism was no longer in India a couple of centuries after Lama Atisha and what have you. It died out in India and, of course, was disseminated to many other countries. Lama Atisha is a really interesting historical figure. He lived about 1,000 years ago. I'm not going to go into the details of his life so much. It's a very interesting story, and we'll touch on it as part of the Middle-Length Lamrim course. Because at the beginning of each of the Lamrims is sort of a homage and a speaking about the amazing greatness and qualities of the author. The author is Lama Atisha because he is the one who started the Lamrim tradition. It's not that he, again, came up with something new in terms of the teachings. He took the teachings of the Buddha and created this wonderful structure. So let's talk about Lama Atisha, who he was and what he was all about. Again, an amazing being and practitioner that we can really be inspired by. I might mention that for both Lama Atisha and Lama Tsongkhapa, Shambhala Publications has recently published biographies of each of them that are really quite rich. I haven't read all of Tsongkhapa's yet, but I've read a good part of that, and then some of Lama Atisha's, not all of that either. But again, really, really important that we know about these beings and their importance on our Buddhist path in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Atisha Dipamkara, as he's often called, lived from 982 to 1054, again, just about 1,000 years ago. I always find it interesting to kind of think about what was going on in Western civilization. We like to think Western civilization was so advanced, but those were kind of barbaric times in Europe, 982 to 1054 with the Dark Ages, right? I think the beginning of that, and then when Tsongkhapa appeared, it's more like the Middle Ages, not really. There's certainly some intellect and stuff going on in Europe, but it's amazing the teachings that came out of these parts of the world at times when in the West we were kind of struggling a bit. He studied both Sutra and Tantra, again, both those more common teachings as well as the hidden teachings with many great masters, and was one of the abbots at Vikramashila Monastery in India. At this time, Nalanda Monastery, we are part of, His Holiness emphasizes Nalanda Monastery as the tradition that Tibetan Buddhism comes from. Vikramashila was very associated with Nalanda. At that time, Nalanda was starting to phase out, but Vikramashila Monastery was really quite a seat of learning, and he was one of the abbots there. He was an Indian Buddhist. He's not Tibetan. He was invited to Tibet to reinvigorate the Buddha Dharma there, specifically with the request to summarize and clarify the key elements distilled from the Buddhist teachings, what's come to be known as the Kangyur. By the way, we have the Kangyur and the Tengyur. I don't know which side is which. Do you know which side is which, Venerable Dunda? Or anyone in the room? They're in the Gompa here on either side. Remember when these came in many, many years ago to Tupten Norbaling, were stored over on Alameda Street. Do you know, Rachel, which is which? Kangyur on my right and Tengyur on my left. It's very possible. And when they arrive, we had this like ceremony for these amazing teachings. The Tengyur are the Indian commentaries which explain them. And so again, you had all of these teachings, that are there that we can distill the essence of what the Buddha taught. And there wasn't a text that really had done that in Tibet. Remember, Tibetan Buddhism had come to Tibet about 3 or 4 centuries before Lama Atisha. It was the great master Shantarakshita who started the monastic tradition in Tibet. And then there was Guru Padmasambhava, Guru Rinpoche over here on the Thangka, who came and sort of quieted all of the interfering forces that were getting in the way of the Buddha Dharma taking root and being disseminated in Tibet. So you had all these amazing happenings going on 3 centuries, 4 centuries before Lama Atisha. But there was a loss of some integrity of the teachings and no real clear pathway. It was a bit like what I was saying in the meditation. People hearing about Buddhism, but not really knowing how to structure it, how to practice it in one's life. And the monastic tradition was even really not that strong. Lama Atisha was asked by the king of Western Tibet at the time to come into Tibet to do this, to essentially provide some sort of a resource to help people to know how to practice the path, to summarize and clarify, as it says, are the key elements from both what the Buddha taught initially, as well as the Indian commentaries of these great masters, Nagarjuna, Sangha, all these others who had already written extensive commentaries on the Buddha's teachings. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. To fulfill that request, he offered, composed the lamp for the path to enlightenment, which is in verse form. It's not that many verses. I forget the exact number. I don't know if it's like 60, 70 verses, something like that, maybe longer. It might be longer. I've had teachings on it from His Holiness the Dalai Lama. It is the root text. Again, it is the text in which the Lamrim is initially set out. Atisha's lamp, as it's going to be abbreviated to in most of our references, became the prototype and the main textual source for the Lamrim genre. So this is kind of the Buddhist teachings are obviously the main source, but then the Lamrim becomes the source of everything that followed it. The lamp becomes the source for all the Lamrim texts that followed from that. So this is an important text to know to some degree. What I want to point out before we go on to Lama Tsongkhapa, and where I am going to do a little bit more on a few verses of Lama Atisha's text, that you get some introduction to that. The most notable element of the Lamrim that Atisha devised was its focus on what's come to be known as the 3 individuals. These 3 encompass all the aims of the Buddhist teachings, both the more temporal goal of gaining a good rebirth, which has come to be known as high status, as well as the ultimate goals that we already spoke to, right? In the Hinayana, the individual vehicle, the goal of liberation, and in the Mahayana, the universal vehicle, the goal of enlightenment. Those 2 together and talked about as being what we call definite goodness. By definite goodness, we mean, getting a good rebirth, having high status is a goodness. We all have it being human beings. This high status that we possess is a worthwhile goal on a temporal basis because it gives you the opportunity to study and practice the Dharma. But it's not a definite goodness because it can change, right? We can end up with a good rebirth and then maybe we don't use it so well. There are various karmas that ripen and suddenly we end up in our next life in an unfortunate state. There's nothing definite about that. So again, the definite goodness is the states that we can attain where you will have that goodness guaranteed. When you attain liberation, the state of nirvana, that's your state for time immemorial. You will not ever degenerate from that state. When you attain enlightenment, same thing. That's a complete state from which you will never have to go back to an unenlightened existence. So the idea behind this is when we bring down to its essential points, what did the Buddha teach in all of those teachings in the Kangyur? What are all the teachings in the Tengyur about, all those in Indian commentaries? They all boil down to these essential goals. The one goal of getting high status that's more temporal, and the two goals of liberation and enlightenment that are more definite, that are more ultimate in regard to our spiritual path. Okay, so that's kind of giving us some structure in regard to these three individuals. You have some that are just desiring to have a good rebirth, that high status, some hinting on a path to attaining liberation, and then some that aspire on the Mahayana path to attaining full enlightenment. All right. So this is a little quote from this kind of interesting book called Tibetan Literature, Studies in Genre, that Jose Ignacio Cabezon and Roger Jackson published many, many years ago. A Lamrim proper is a work that expounds the stages of the path of the three individuals. That is, it aims at being a complete introduction to spirituality, leading the student through the stages of the two lower spiritual orientations or individuals. The first one, who is that one who aspires for high status, a better rebirth, and then the second one, which is the Hinayana practitioner that aspires for individual liberation, before reaching the highest level, that of the Mahayana great individual who aspires to attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all living beings. So this is really at the heart of what we mean by the Lamrim. You're setting out a stages of the path that pertains to three levels of practitioner. The initial practitioner that will be solely focused on a good rebirth, the next level of practitioner that is looking for attaining some freedom from their own cycle of existence, own samsara, and then the third that wants to go beyond that to attain the state of Buddhahood to benefit all beings. These are very clearly laid out in Lama Atisha's text. Let me go ahead and share those verses with you. It's really easy to go through these. The first one comes from verse 2 of his text. I don't remember what the first verse is. I never use it in my teachings, but understand that there are three kinds of persons because of their small, middling, and supreme capacities. Their capabilities are, gradually greater, taking on more and more. Not just a good rebirth, but liberation, not just liberation, but enlightenment. I shall write clearly, distinguishing their individual characteristics. What's kind of interesting is this is the core of the Lamrim, but Lama Atisha didn't really, in the text itself, talk much more beyond these initial verses. This is the first level, the first individual. Know that those who, by whatever means, seek for themselves no more than the pleasures of psychic existence are persons of the least capacity. In other words, they want something within samsara, a good rebirth within samsara that is pleasurable in terms of, comparatively to the lower states of existence in the hell realms and so on. But it's really just, again, a samsaric pleasure that they're seeking. The fourth verse here. Those who seek peace for themselves alone, turning away from worldly pleasures and avoiding destructive actions, are said to be of middling capacity. Again, they're seeking nirvana for themselves. This is the second level. This is, again, one of the two results that are definite goodness, and it is a path that the Buddha taught, as did the Buddha teach the path to gaining a good rebirth. But it's not the final goal. It's not the supreme goal. Those who, through their personal suffering, truly want to end completely all the suffering of others are persons of supreme capacity. By that first line there, through their personal suffering, it means through having to engage in whatever it takes to develop themselves fully. It said that it takes quite a bit of energy and accumulation of merit and what have you to become a Buddha. Those who are willing to do that engage in whatever it takes to benefit all beings, to help them to be free from their suffering, are the persons of the supreme capacity, the greatest capacity. So essentially, Lama Atisha was laying out, again, these three different individuals that all have three different goals. You know, the first goal being much more temporal, the other two being more definite, but nonetheless, you know, the ultimate goal, the final goal being Buddhahood. So now we're going to see again where this goes from here in terms of the general presentation of teachings that go into this. I'm not going to go into great detail because most of you are familiar somewhat with Lamrim, and this is what is more or less the structure for what we're going to be looking at when we start the actual text in November. There are generally some preliminary topics that are laid out in a Lamrim, such as relying on the guru, our spiritual mentors and teachers, and also recognizing this perfect human rebirth that we have, this amazing opportunity that is rich in leisures and rich in our ability to use it meaningfully. That leads us into how do we use this birth? Having met with our gurus, these wonderful teachers who can give us these teachings that are helping us to attain our final goal, what's the best use of this human rebirth? Well, we see it's divided into the three scopes pertaining to these three beings. The lower capable being, this is the person of the lowest capacity who has the motivation to attain a favorable rebirth, again, high status. There we look at death and impermanence, the fact that this life isn't going to last forever. We may end up in an unfortunate state. Therefore, we have to take refuge in the three jewels, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And we have to practice the law of karma and attend to our actions so we create the causes for good rebirths and avoid the causes for unfavorable ones. That's in essence what we're going to look at in the Lamrim in that first section pertaining to the lower capable being. This is, by the way, the phrasing Lama Zopa Rinpoche liked: lower capable being, middle capable being, great capable being. The person of middling capacity has the motivation to attain self-liberation, right? They want to gain the state of nirvana. Well, to do that, they have to look at the bigger picture, not just how we have rebirths and control our rebirths to some degree. We have to understand the degrees of suffering or dukkha that we are involved in, the causes of that, essentially what is all involved in samsara, again, the cycle of existence, and know a bit about the three higher trainings of morality, concentration, and wisdom that are rooted in the Buddha's teachings that are the means of attaining nirvana. So again, all of the details on that we'll go into much greater depth when we get to the Lamrim text itself. But this is the teachings of the Buddha that pertain to how to attain the goal of the middling capacity person, the person who wants to attain nirvana. The person of great capacity who has the motivation to attain Buddhahood for the sake of all beings, their primary practices are to generate the mind of bodhicitta, which we generated at the beginning of tonight, right? And we do that before all of our classes. The mind aspiring to become a Buddha for the sake of all beings. Again, looking beyond our own welfare. The six perfections, the paramitas, generosity, morality, patience, joyous effort or enthusiasm, concentration, wisdom. These are the practices of a bodhisattva done with bodhicitta so you can attain Buddhahood, as well as the four means of gathering disciples. These are all the sutra teachings that support the specific levels of these three beings, these three individuals. So this is, again, how we often see it. And these are initially laid out in terms of the content of the Lamrim. In a sense, that's how we know where we're going, what it is that we need to do to engage in a gradual process. We're going to see this being emphasized more by Lama Tsongkhapa. When Lama Atisha laid it out, he really talked about three individuals. Oh, you have these people who do this, and you have these people who do that, and then you have these people who do something even greater. So it's really laid out as more of a kind of an assessment of three different types of practitioners of Buddhism. When we get to Lama Tsongkhapa's presentation, it becomes more about the individual stages of one practitioner that you need to engage in all three in order to achieve the fullness of your potential. So we'll get to that in a moment when we present Lama Tsongkhapa's teachings. Okay, so let's carry on. There'll be hopefully some time for questions if you're having any questions on this. If you can't remember them, please write them down and I'll give a chance for you to ask them shortly. Let's talk about Lama Tsongkhapa and his expositions of the Lamrim. Essentially, when you deal with Lama Atisha's text, that, as I said, kind of becomes the root text. All the other Lamrim texts, especially those by Tsongkhapa, are essentially commentaries on that. Commentaries really quite uniquely on those 3 verses or 4 verses, where we look at this idea of these 3 individuals. Lama Tsongkhapa lived, again, 1357 to 1419, when Europe was dealing with the Middle Ages and what have you. An unparalleled scholar and practitioner who revitalized many sutra and tantra lineages and the monastic tradition as well in Tibet. You know, there's many other accomplishments. If you want to can know more about Lama Tsongkhapa's life, the biography that's written that I mentioned earlier is by Thupten Jinpa, who is an amazing scholar himself, who was His Holiness the Dalai Lama's translator for many years. Lama Tsongkhapa is renowned also, as it says there, as the founder of the Gelug school of Tibetan Buddhism, again, the last of the 4 schools to form. He also it's kind of interesting, one of his students was the first Dalai Lama. The lineage of the Dalai Lamas are often trained in the Gelug tradition, but it doesn't mean they don't know the other traditions. They also are trained in them, but their monastic schooling generally is done in the Gelug school, which is again a major part of what Lama Tsongkhapa reinstated and strengthened in Tibet. I found this comment quite interesting from Thupten Jinpa. He says he lived at a time when the translation of the Kangyur and the Tengyur, again, the Buddha's teachings and the commentaries of Indian masters on them, when that translation into Tibetan had largely been completed. You know, what's interesting is when these teachings were disseminated to different countries, of course, you know, you'd have to learn Sanskrit to be able to read them, right? Because all the Mahayana corpus of teachings are all in Sanskrit. Not that many people knew Sanskrit. They'd want them in their own language so that they could then study and engage in them, you know, digest them. In Tibet, it's actually said, my understanding is that a lot of the written scripture of Tibet it was created in order to have this vehicle of disseminating the Sanskrit teachings into a common language in Tibet. So they had to do this painstaking process of bringing all the Sanskrit sutras and commentaries and what have you into Tibet and translated meticulously into the Tibetan language, so that Tibetans could read them and study them in the monasteries and what have you. Well, by the time Tsongkhapa shows up, he's at like this amazing moment in time when most of this had been completed, thus making him one of the first Tibetan masters with access to the entire canons of Indian Buddhism. What is kind of notable about that, and we won't see it as much in the middle-length Lamrim, but if you look at the great treatise, the Lamrim Chenmo that he wrote, and I'll talk about that in a moment, he uses extensive citations of these great masters and the sutras as well, because he had access to all of this, was able to study and digest all of this. I talked earlier about how looking at the Buddha's teachings, it might be quite overwhelming to think about trying to go through them all. Well, Lama Tsongkhapa had the ability to comb through these teachings and pull out what were the essential points that supported the structure that Lama Atisha had given, right? So when you read something like the Great Treatise, which we don't study traditionally in our FPMT studies, it's not one of the texts that we actually do, though many people spend their time reading them and they're wonderfully rich in those citations. It gives you an appreciation for what Lama Tsongkhapa was able to do because of that fact that I just had on the screen, because he had access to all of this that many of the masters before him didn't, because those teachings weren't yet translated into Tibet. Into Tibetan. So this is, again, something I found quite interesting and gives an appreciation for what Lama Tsongkhapa was able to do, but also, of course, his own capabilities of being able to digest all of those teachings and pull out some, you know, again, very vital citations that support everything that is in the Lamrim. He was deeply taken by the elegance and completeness of Lama Atisha's lamp, and composed a number of Lamrim texts of varying length, commenting on that root text. He is the only author that I'm aware of that composed more than one. I think there's probably a number of them done by various masters, and I'll give you a place where you can go and look at some of these other Lamrim commentaries that are out there. But Here are the texts that he composed, the first two being the most important to some degree, though the other ones playing a role as well and are often studied in our tradition. The first one was written in 1402, the great treatise on the stages of the path, what's often called the Lamrim Chenmo. Many of you have probably seen this, perhaps tried to read it. It's 3 volumes. It's really quite large. Of course, I held up this. This is like this. It's 3 that are pretty much this size. The middle one is a little shorter, a little smaller, but essentially it's quite large. In addition, we have published commentary by Geshe Lama Zopa, who was one of Lama Zopa's teachers, who gave extensive commentary at Deer Park near Madison, Wisconsin. And so that's 5 volumes. So if you studied those 5 volumes of commentary with the 3 volumes of the text, it's a pretty heavy undertaking. I know some people that have actually read them multiple times, so don't think that you can't do it. And it would be wonderful at some time to engage in a full, deep study of the Lamrim Chenmo. But nonetheless, what we have in this text, as you'll see, the middle-length Lamrim, is pretty comparable and even has a few areas where it might be superior. The middle-length treatise, the one that we are going to be studying starting in November, was written in 1415. Recall that Lama Tsongkhapa died 2 years later. I might mention that in regard to that, part of it, especially the section that is most relevant and most complicated, the section on special insight or the perfection of wisdom, was published in this book called The Final Exposition of Wisdom by Tsongkhapa, Tsongkhapa's Final Exposition of Wisdom. The translation of that done by Jeffrey Hopkins here, it's kind of like Lama Tsongkhapa's not quite final because he did publish some more texts after that, but in those last few years, he really had some final things to say. It's kind of interesting. These masters, you would think they sort of got it right the first time in a sense, and there's nothing wrong with the great treatise. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying there's anything wrong there. He just had another way of approaching some subjects, particularly that final subject, which is so important, so crucial to the Lamrim, because it really is the key to attaining Buddhahood, removing all of what obscures our mind by realizing the wisdom of emptiness. The special insight section is really quite profound. I'll talk about that more in a moment. So these are the first 2 that are really most important when it comes to the Lamrim commentaries or texts that Tsongkhapa composed. And I'll talk more about the middle-length one shortly. There's also what comes to be known in some circles as the concise treatise on the stages of the path. It's really concise. It's like 20-some verses. It's usually translated as a song of spiritual experience or lines of experience. It's a wonderful little short text. It's not quite what we might call a glance meditation on the Lamrim, which the other 2 that are up here are. A glance meditation is where you just are looking at the main topics of the Lamrim. This does give some instruction, but it's really, really brief. As I said, kind of 25, 26 longer verses. It's not real short verses, but nonetheless, a really, really concise exposition of the Lamrim. He also wrote what's come to be known as the 3 principal aspects of the path, which pertains to the 3 main realizations we gain from our Lamrim studies, which are renunciation, bodhicitta, and the correct view of emptiness. Again, we're not going to look at that much more as part of this, but that's like only a 14, 15 verse text. Foundation of all good qualities, another kind of glance meditation on the Lamrim, looking at the various topics. I think that also is 13 or 14 verses. I don't have dates on those 2 that are not dated there. And I don't think they do have dates. I don't know that I looked at the biography and couldn't find when he composed those, but they were very short ones. The one that he's most known for perhaps is the first one, the Great Treatise. But the middle-length Lamrim has, again, its own benefits in studying that I'll talk about shortly. Thupten Jinpa does mention there were also a few instructions on the Lamrim that he composed at the request of various individuals. Those are not really become common teachings in our tradition. These 5, as we'll see, that are all up above there and named, are included in the 18 treatises that we're going to talk about and introduce you to shortly. This is a comment, again, from Thupten Jinpa. Lama Tsongkhapa emphasized, I mentioned this a short while ago, that the framework of the Lamrim was not presenting the path of 3 different types of persons. Again, Lama Atisha kind of presents it that way. You have person A, person B, person C, each with their own unique goals. but rather was presenting a graduated course to enlightenment, to the final goal, from the perspective of a single practitioner whose aim is to attain Buddhahood for the sake of all beings. And it's really quite an important point, because it then kind of frames it in terms of, you don't think, oh, well, I'm the person of great capacity. And so what I need to do is practice what's set out for that person who's, person C. You really see that everything the Buddha taught, even prior to that, for person B and person A, is equally relevant to you as a practitioner. That's the miracle of the Lamrim, and particularly the way that Lama Tsongkhapa emphasized these three levels, these three stages of the path. What he ended up doing, and I'm going to show that same chart that I showed you a while ago. I won't talk about all the topics because I already did. What he did is where I've underlined on the left-hand side there. The first one is the stages of the path shared with the person of lowest capacity. It's like you have to work with those teachings first. Then you share also with the person of middling capacity, the next level of teachings. And then you finally arrive at the third level, which are the stages of the path that are applicable to you, developing your mind into the state of a Buddha, but they depend upon having gone through the shared paths. So there we see it as a path that leads through all of those, not kind of around them in any way. I'm going to really head just for the third level and forget the other two. We really see the applicability of these teachings to us individually as practitioners. Not that our goal is the same as someone who's just a lower capable being, because our goal isn't just to get a good rebirth. Our goal also isn't just to get our own liberation. Our goal is Buddhahood, but we practice the same teachings as them with that higher aim. It's really quite profound. I love the Lamrim. I think it's just one of the most amazing presentations. This is another quote from Thupten Jinpa in his introduction. It says, "For Tsongkhapa, what is important is that you engage in your practice on the basis of your having an understanding of the overall framework of the Buddha's teaching and seeing the entire body of the path. The image here is one of a spiritual traveler embarking on a journey with a clear map of where he is going. Tsongkhapa sees that the Lamrim framework of the paths of the three types of persons has offering exactly such a type of map." So essentially what we have in the way Lama Tsongkhapa is approaching it, and his unique spin he put on what Lama Atisha taught, which was his spin on what the Buddha taught, is this idea of all of the teachings being applicable to you as an individual practitioner. So how wonderful. Again, we've got the whole clear path. We've got our map. We know where we're going. We know what we need to do to develop these teachings that support getting all the way to the goal of Buddhahood. Again, every one of them being absolutely relevant. I called this class the timeless relevance, because really there's nothing that's changed from the time of the Buddha to now in terms of these teachings. Sure, the whole concept of rebirth isn't taught in our Western culture as much, except by people who've been exposed to it through Eastern culture, perhaps. So the idea is that there are some things that maybe are foreign to us, but the truths that the Buddha taught and the path that the Buddha taught is equally relevant now as it was 2,500 years ago, as it was in the time of Atisha 1,000 years ago, as it was at the time of Tsongkhapa, 600 years ago. So we essentially are dealing with this relevance of these teachings that on our spiritual path are very important to take note of and to engage in fully. A very brief introduction to these 18 Lamrim commentaries. In addition to these foundational texts composed by Tsongkhapa, many Lamrim commentaries have been written by both what kind of preceded the Geluk tradition, what are the Kadam masters that followed Lama Atisha, as well as Geluk Lamas. A number of those commentaries, along with the root text of the Lamp by Lama Atisha and the main Lamrim texts of Tsongkhapa, those 5 that we looked at, comprise the 18 Lamrim commentaries. I'll be giving these slides, as I usually do, to Venerable Dundrup, who's so kind in putting them out there on the page for this class tonight on a materials button. You can go there and you can click on that. Let me actually go ahead and pull up that page so you get an idea of what that looks like. There was a wonderful set of teachings that His Holiness gave in India, where he gave the oral transmissions of all of these 18 commentaries at a website called jangchuplamrim.org. There is a page with these 18 Lamrim commentaries. You'll notice that it's divided into the first group of what says, they say 9, but it's the 8 commentaries on Lamp for the Path. The first 2, the ones by Tsongkhapa that are longer and so on. And then the third one, the shorter one that Tsongkhapa did that was the concise, the Song of Spiritual Experience. Then you'll notice number 5 there, if you can read it. I know it's quite small on the screen. The Essence of Refined Gold. Well, does anyone recall that name? That's what Geshe Sherab's been teaching on Sundays, right? Wonderful text by the 3rd Dalai Lama, right? And then the Easy Path, the Sacred Words of Manjushri, Swift Path, Essence of Fine Speech. These are all what are called the 8 great commentaries. Then you have another set of commentaries that constitute the full 18 with those 9 that were presented. Again, these are by other masters, Tibetan masters, what have you. Includes the 2 that I mentioned by Tsongkhapa, 3 Principal Aspects, Foundation of All Good Qualities, and then a number of others. Number 17 there, you'll notice a book that hopefully you're familiar with, Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand, the one I mentioned that was my first encounter with the Lamrim back in 1996, I believe it was. So again, just know that these are out there. Many of them have been translated into English. There are a few that haven't. And again, you can study any Lamrim text to gain an appreciation for the Lamrim. We might look now in these last bit of our time together, why would we want to study in particular the middle length Lamrim? What are the benefits of that? And what are the advantages of that particular text? Again, there is huge benefit to the great treatise. Don't get me wrong. Lama Tsongkhapa's Lamrim Chenmo is the most amazing work. I remember being really, really touched by His Holiness's words back in 2008 when he was teaching on the Lamrim Chenmo in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania at Lehigh University. Were you there, Rachel, for that? Wonderful teachings. He only had it 5-6 days to teach on this huge text. So he pulled out the essential points and taught on them. But what he had done is he had brought with him his Tibetan text. It's made of the pecha, the loose leaf papers and what have you, wrapped in a beautiful, silk or cloth cover and what have you. He brought it out before he began, and you could almost see tears in his eyes because he was talking about how this was the same version of this text that he brought with him from Tibet in 1959 when he left. And it was one that he made absolutely sure that he brought. That kind of gives me goosebumps even thinking about it because, again, that is really the most profound and complete exposition of the stages of the path. The Lamrim jewel that Atisha, in coming to Tibet, created there as this foundation for learning that Lama Tsongkhapa expounded upon in that amazing text. And His Holiness had such reverence and devotion to it that was one of the texts he made sure that he brought with him out of Tibet to India when he went in exile. So anyway, don't get me wrong. It's really worthwhile to study the great treatise. It's just a little more complicated to do a course on it because it would go on for probably 5 or 6 years. It's huge. Again, this is about 1/3 the volume of the great treatise, and we're going to do it in a year plus some months. Haven't quite figured out how I'm going to squeeze it even in that. I think the last time I taught it, it was quite long, probably over 2 years. But I also did include some additional commentary on things here and there. But nonetheless, it's got a lot to it. So that's the main reason why the great treatise isn't taught in more detail, more extensively, is simply because it does take a long time to go through it. We will, on occasion, as we go through it, pull in a few things maybe here and there from the Lamrim Chenmo. But just know that this is one of the great texts too. It's number 2. We're not going to study number 1, but it's number 2 on the list of the 18. Let's go into the particular significance of this text we're going to study. It was composed, again, roughly 13 years. It was began in 1401, completed in 1402, after the Great Treatise. It served a number of purposes. First of all, it is a bit more practice-oriented than the Great Treatise. Because it's a little bit shorter, the topics can be used as a guide for practicing and meditating on a little bit more easily. If you think about, again, what I mentioned earlier, that Tsongkhapa had access to all of the great Indian masters, the Indian Buddhism commentaries and original discourses, he was able to pull all of these quotations and citations that were so rich. And when you read the Lamrim, you really gain an appreciation for the depth of research that he did to put it together. But if you're a practitioner looking to meditate on the Lamrim, those things become maybe somewhat problematic. They're still wonderful tools to use to meditate. Don't get me wrong, when you meditate on the Lamrim, you can use quotations as a very valuable touchstone to get to a place of realizing those topics. You use quotations, you use logic, you use the outlines, you use a variety of tools to be able to meditate on the Lamrim. So it's not that, again, the quotations are just peripheral and not needed. It's just that when you are looking for something that's more concise that you can actually use as a practice manual, you need something that's free of a little bit of that verbiage so you can actually focus on the main topics. As you'll see, there's still plenty of verbiage in it. Don't get me wrong there either. The Middle-Length Lamrim does have quite a few citations, quotations that Lama Tsongkhapa felt were fairly important to maintain from the Great Treatise. In it, he condensed most sections of the Great Treatise for ease of use and study by omitting those elaborate citations from Indian sources that were used in the earlier text. So he essentially took what was already tried and true as a discourse on the Lamrim in his Great Treatise, kept it intact, and again, shed a bit of the extra verbiage so that we could actually, again, have something that's a bit more condensed. So it allows us to be more practice-oriented, but it also allows us to have something that is not quite as elaborate to engage in greater study. Great Treatise is well worth doing for that, but nonetheless, the Middle-Length Lamrim does afford some benefit in regard to both of those points. It also, most importantly, includes a revised presentation of the section on special insight. I mentioned this earlier. Special insight is the term that's often used to refer to what we are accomplishing with the perfection of wisdom, that sixth perfection or paramita on the Mahayana path. Essentially, it is an explication of the meaning of what's come to be known as the Madhyamaka view, the middle way view. The middle way view, of course, was taught by many great masters. It goes back to the Buddha. Again, the Buddha is the source of all these teachings, and the teachings he gave that are the Prajnaparamita Sutras, which he gave in a number of venues, primarily on Vulture's Peak near Rajagriha. Again, most of you are familiar with the Heart Sutra, but he expounded on the essence of the Heart Sutra in very great detail in various Prajnaparamita Sutras. That was explained by the great Indian master Nagarjuna in his text, the fundamental treatise on wisdom called The Middle Way. And then Lama Tsongkhapa himself expounded on what Nagarjuna gathered from his researching into special insight, the perfection of wisdom. So essentially, in every Lamrim text, following after Lama Atisha and all of these great commentaries, there's usually two main perfections that are detailed. One of them is the fifth perfection, the perfection of concentration, because we do need to have greater instruction about how we develop what's come to be known as calm abiding, or shine in Tibetan, shamatha in the Sanskrit. That's a very single-pointedly focused mind that allows us to penetrate the teachings very deeply and to change our minds. Remember how I mentioned earlier very briefly these three higher trainings. You need good morality, which is what you initially practice on the path, but then you need concentration and wisdom. Concentration is referring to that ability to stay with your meditation object for an extended period of time with an undistracted mind. Very powerful accomplishment in and of itself. Every Lamrim text goes into some, talking about the greater commentaries, not like the foundation of all good qualities, these kind of short, more glance meditations. All of them go into great detail about how you accomplish that level of meditative stabilization. That's known again as calm abiding. And thank you, the Buddha attained those through practicing as Prince Siddhartha with these other great meditation masters in India at the time, and gladly shares how you too can develop that deep concentration. The next section that is always more extensive is special insight, which pertains to the sixth perfection, the perfection of wisdom. Special insight is Laktung in Tibetan and Vipassana in the Sanskrit. It's referring to a deep penetrative insight into the nature of reality in particular, though sometimes it's also used as a term to include penetration into the nature of all things in terms of even their conventional existence. But we're mainly getting at emptiness, mainly getting at the final ultimate nature, ultimate truth of things. Sorry, not ultimate nature. Things have no ultimate nature. They have an ultimate truth about them, which is that they lack any inherent nature. Again, this is what we're going to go into in the last part of, I'm kind of dividing up the Lamrim course into a number of parts. In the last part, we'll go into those two major expositions: how to develop calm abiding, this very deep meditative state, and then how to penetrate into deep wisdom. So going back to our text, the Middle-Length Lamrim, what's quite interesting is if you had these side by side, the volume that is containing the special insight and calm abiding section of the Lamrim Chenmo, the great treatise, and then what we have in the book we're going to be studying, the chapter on special insight is very different. Like it starts the same and it ends the same, but what's in the middle is really quite unique. And it's a very different presentation. Again, going back to that book I mentioned earlier, Jeffrey Hopkins, it's Lama Tsongkhapa's, one of his final expositions on wisdom, a final exposition to really help us to generate the middle way, the Madhyamika view. The middle way is kind of finding that way between these two extremes, where we are now and tend to hold to, of grasping at everything as being real and inherently existent, and the extreme we could fall into when we begin to investigate things, thinking that things don't exist at all, a sort of more permanent view and a nihilistic view. These two views are the extremes that you find the middle way between. And Lama Tsongkhapa's teachings are amazing in helping you to find that middle way. But of course, before him, Nagarjuna and the great master Chandrakirti, who expounded on that, Buddha Palita, all these other great masters of the middle way, also found that correct view. But it is hard to find. It is hard to get to that point of that exact middle between these two extremes. So Lama Tsongkhapa is renowned for his teachings on that. The Lamrim Chenmo has its own format. And it's very hard when you get to that section to compare the two because, as I said, in the middle between the beginning and the end, it's very, very different. So let's take a look in particular about what is said by Jeffrey Hopkins in his book where he's talking about this. He says here, meaning in the Middle-Length Lamrim special insight section that he translated, Tsongkhapa presents the topic of wisdom in a far more accessible manner than he did 16 years earlier in his great treatise on the stages of the path. In other sections of the medium-length exposition, he merely condenses the great treatise. But for the section on wisdom, again, special insight, perfection of wisdom, he structures a new composition, with the exception that the beginning and the end are condensations of the great treatise. So he kind of said, yeah, I did really good in starting it and ending it, but what I put in the middle, I'd really like to say it differently now. And that's quite profound. I mean, again, shows that he had the skill and ability to see the same teachings that will help you get to the same realization in a very different way. The most striking addition is the long section on what have come to be known as the two truths, which again, the Buddha taught. This isn't something that Lama Tsongkhapa came up that was new. He says there's no corresponding section at all in the great treatise for the presentation on the two truths that we see in the Middle-Length Lamrim. I might stop it here. And again, there's some more things that are different about that section that are maybe more minor points. The two truths, His Holiness Dalai Lama says this is one of the most essential teachings we need to get. In fact, sometimes when he gives a more general teaching on the Buddhist path, he starts with the two truths. Well, he introduces the idea of, compassion and Buddhahood and all of that. But then he goes into the two truths as like the basis upon which the entire path is built. And understanding that there are things that exist conventionally that have their own way of existing that's quite subtle. And then we have the ultimate truth of things, that things don't exist in this concrete, inherent, independent way. So essentially, those two truths spell out the two things that we need to realize, because we don't even realize conventional truths correctly. We realize the ultimate truth that things lack this concrete way of existing, and then we finally get the very subtle way that everything else does exist. And these two are completely compatible. This is the middle way, again, where we bring everything into this final view that allows us to still hold that things exist, but not that they exist in this erroneous way. So again, this is a very profound teaching that His Holiness makes that the basis upon which we then generate an understanding of the Four Noble Truths, and then we generate an understanding of the Three Jewels, and we can generate the sense of refuge with that full understanding of the whole basis for why the Buddhist teachings work, why the Four Noble Truths work, why it is possible to attain enlightenment. Again, that won't be something I have time to go into in great detail tonight, but if you ever get a chance to take a look, I think it's presented, trying to think of the book right now. I know it's in part of this series that he's put together with Venerable Children. That's quite long. He does talk in there about it, but nonetheless, this is the way His Holiness often approaches it. So getting a detailed teaching on how we arrive at the understanding of these two truths, conventional and ultimate truth, or obscurational and conventional truth, as some are sometimes called, is a really important feature of this text we're going to study. I might mention that this is in particular why Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who was kind of behind the scenes and more involved at sometimes in designing the basic program. There was a whole team of geshes, I think, that were involved in spelling out which texts were studied. But Lama Zopa Rinpoche was very keen on using the middle-length Lamrim because of the presentation of the two truths, because we gain such a rich understanding of them from what Tsongkhapa says in there. So it's really, again, one of the most important features of this work. I'll mention just briefly, and then we'll conclude and see if there'll be a little bit of time for questions, perhaps. The other things, also, of 146 scriptural citations from Indian texts in the section on special insight in the medium-length exposition. So you see there's no shortage of scriptural citations. 76 of them, which is over half, right, are not found in the Great Treatise. He did do additional research. Lama Tsongkhapa found other sources to expound upon the teachings he put into this middle-length Lamrim on the topic of special insight. The medium-length exposition of special insight has 70 quotations that are found in the special insight section of the Great Treatise, but in a radically different order. The other thing, he reordered everything. He looked at what he did originally and said, no, I'm going to put this here and I put that there. I'm going to give a whole new presentation. And it's a wonderful presentation. Again, I've taught this once before. I haven't spent more time with it since then, but it is an amazing presentation. Really does flow really quite nicely. There are some parts of the Great Treatise that are really kind of rough going. It's a harder special insight section to get through. Never taught it. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do that in this life anyway, but now here's the point that Jeffrey Hopkins is making about what we just saw about these citations, that more than half of the quotations from Indian texts in the medium-length exposition are not found in the Great Treatise, and that those that are in the Great Treatise are in a fundamentally different order, illustrate the uniqueness of Tsongkhapa's presentation of special insight in the medium-length exposition. He's really giving us something quite unique and quite profound. In this new exposition, he presents at length the two truths, obscurational or conventional, I put there in brackets, truths, and ultimate truth, from the viewpoint of Chandrakirti's middle way consequence school, with particular emphasis on a number of topics. I'm not going to delineate them there for you. They're on pages 22 to 23, the introduction of that text I mentioned, the final exposition of Tsongkhapa. But essentially, he goes into great detail on these two truths. It's really, again, one of the richest things about the text we're going to be studying. Tsongkhapa also cites passages from Nagarjuna's 60 stanzas of reasoning to show that emptiness, what we are realizing with that special insight, is approached through the reasoning of dependent arising. This was what Nagarjuna said, and of course the Buddha said, but Nagarjuna emphasized, and Tsongkhapa wants to emphasize as part of this final exposition, that nirvana also is empty of inherent existence, another major point that he goes into, and that Buddhas do perceive conventional phenomena, that they don't just not in the space of just like abiding in complete knowledge of emptiness without any awareness of conventional reality. Again, these are minor points, but they are points that come up. So there are a lot of other additional points he brings in. He also explains passages in Nagarjuna's praise of the element of attributes and another praise, the praise of the supramundane, to show that his collection of praises, a number of texts that he wrote that are praises, that collection is harmonious with his collection of reasonings, which includes the text I mentioned earlier, fundamental wisdom, in terms of the view of reality. Now, why is that important? Because some people look at Nagarjuna's text and think that there's maybe some divergence between what is taught on emptiness in these praises versus the collection of reasonings. Again, not a big point for what we're doing in this introductory thing tonight. But it's, again, speaking to the fact that Tsongkhapa had some additional things to say, some additional things to point out, to uphold the integrity of this view of the middle way that comes from Nagarjuna, expounded upon by Chandrakirti, and practiced by, again, all these great masters, which he is trying to give us another exposition of to help us to gain that correct view of the middle way. So there's a lot of value in what we're looking at in regard to particularly the special insights section. Here's a few quotes I want to close with. Lama Zopa Rinpoche at the Light of the Path retreat back in September of 2009, the very first of these. I think there were 5 or 6 of them in total that we had with Rinpoche, amazing opportunities. Pabanka Rinpoche, again, the composer of Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand, said that meditating on Lamrim is more meaningful than seeing a Buddha. By seeing a Buddha, you don't become enlightened without meditating on Lamrim. You have to have realizations. All the delusions do not go like that. You have to have the realization of Guru devotion, the root of the path to enlightenment, that which makes it possible to have all the realizations up to enlightenment. Renunciation of the delusions, in particular attachment, then the right view realizing emptiness, which eliminates ignorance, then bodhicitta, which eliminates the self-cherishing thought. So we need these realizations and to actualize the generation stage and the completion stage of highest yoga tantra. Again, as I pointed out earlier, we look at everything the Buddha taught. Everything is to get you to the tantric path and the ability to practice to become a Buddha. But you have to have everything that precedes that. All the other teachings support your ability to practice that well. And then a quote from my teacher, Geshe Jampi Gyatso. I remember this so profoundly because actually I got really, really sick the next day. This was at the first day of the teachings of the master's program, the 7-year program I had the good fortune to attend in Italy. He says, just as Lama Tsongkhapa says in one of his texts, to train, one needs to hear many teachings. Then one should reflect repeatedly on them and then meditate on them. In this way, one should dedicate all one's energy to preserving the teachings of the Buddha. By you studying them and engaging in them, you are doing that. You're helping these teachings to continue to be in our world and to be practiced. In particular, though, he said, in regard to listening or studying the teachings, there's an expression by the Kadampa Lamas, again, these great practitioners who followed from Lama Atisha, who were meditator practitioners, that says meditating without listening to teachings is like someone who tries to climb a rock face with their hands closed. You know, that one stuck with me for some reason. I'd never heard it before, and I've heard it several times since. But I'm also wanting to give you that kind of impetus for why do you need to study the Lamrim? Why do you need to come to a class like that? Again, it's not for my sake that you're coming to the class. It's for the benefit of your own mind and for the Dharma to continue to be in this world and for you to be able to benefit other beings. But to do that, to really fully develop your mind, as Rinpoche was saying in the earlier quote, you have to study. Otherwise, you're like, how am I going to climb up this rock face when my fists are closed? I don't even have fingers to grasp onto anything. It's an analogy that I think works pretty effectively. If you just sit down to meditate and you go, oh, again, I'm going to meditate on this. That sounds nice. I'll meditate on that. Yeah, you might gain some experience of those particular topics, but you're going to probably be way afield of where you need to go in terms of actually attaining enlightenment. This is the amazing gift of the Lamrim, is we had, again, the Buddha's teachings put into the structure by Lama Atisha, refined and expounded upon by Lama Tsongkhapa and so many other masters. We have this at our liberation in the palm of our hand. We have it right there. We just need to engage in it and study it and practice it. So I hope I've inspired you somewhat by presenting what I did tonight. Let me see if there are any comments or questions from anybody on anything I talked about. Yes, Lou, please. We'll get you got the microphone there. Wonderful. And again, if you're online, just put your little hand icon under the React button at the bottom of your screen. You can find it.
What's so special about Steve Quantico's translation?
Oh, Philip
Philip.
Barco. I have to admit, I haven't read this final version yet. When I first taught this was back, geez, I want to remember what years it was, 2011, 12, I don't know, somewhere in there. I can't remember the years that I taught it here at Tuk to Norberling. We had like a working version of it that was a maybe penultimate draft. It was not even the final draft. And then this was revised into this. I have to admit that I found going into that text a little bit of difficulty, but that was because I think in the English translation, it wasn't quite as fine-tuned. I don't believe that I don't know enough about him, but I don't want to criticize him in any way. I know he was asked to do this by initially, and according to the introduction, by our center in Munich, and they wanted an English version of the text, which I don't know. Again, I had some difficulty with it, but that's me. Again, I'm not putting him down by any means. I've heard from people who have used this version of it, which I haven't been able to read through all of it. I've read parts of it. What I've read already sounds really quite smooth and really good. I think that they've done a fine job of taking what was there, the amazing work that he did in translating this, and making it into something that we can all, work with quite well. So again, translations in the FPMT, there's getting to be more attention, and I think it's for quite a while now, on what we call translation equivalence, making sure that when we use a particular Tibetan term in a particular context, that we translate it the same from text to text. And Wisdom Publications has been doing a better job of that with regard to the series of texts that they're putting together, particularly around the Lamrim. That is one of the things that you might find when you go from something like this to the Lamrim Chenmo that was translated by a committee of people, many of whom were students of Jeffrey Hopkins, and we tend to fall pretty close to that tree in terms of the FPMT tradition of translation equivalence. So you will still see differences. There were some times when they made some specific choices about what to use for some words that you will see some differences. Not huge, though. But if you go to something like a Robert Thurman translation of a text, you're like going out into the cosmos or something. It's really quite bizarre. His teachings, or his translation, in my estimation, is pretty Hopkinsese. It's pretty close to Jeffrey Hopkins. I think because of probably the team of people that crafted the English translation after he had already worked with it a bit, that had made it into something that works with our same translation equivalents. So I think it's a pretty good translation from, again, what I've been able to read of it. Actually, that's part of why I want to teach this again, is because they've got the new translation. I might say new, it's been out for a number of years, but at least something that is a more final translation that we can work with. So that's what I have to say on that. Again, we're really indebted to all these great translators who've taken these texts from the Tibetan language and made them into our own language that we can study without knowledge of the Tibetan. Because I don't know Tibetan. I might sound like I know Tibetan by throwing out a few words, but I really don't. Rachel knows a lot more Tibetan than I do. She studied how to become a translator for an interpreter for teachers teaching in Tibetan for a number of years. So, anyone else? Anything before we conclude? We're right at 8:30, but yes, please, Joey. We'll get the microphone over to you there. Great. And again, online, if you do want to add something, you can put it in the chat box as well. But is it on now? Okay. Maybe it's not on yet. Oh. There we go.
Thank you. So I've had this questions wondering in my mind ever since I first learned about or heard about and began to learn about the Lamrim, which would have been April.
Mhm.
How does it intersect, for lack of a better word, with the Eightfold Noble Path, which is what I had always heard
Sure.
before?
Right. Yeah, the Eightfold Noble Path is, the presentation that's often used in the Pali tradition, in the Theravadan tradition. The elements of it are common in that even the Eightfold Path, you can divide those into the three higher trainings. And the three higher trainings, I didn't mention this when I got into the Buddha's teachings, they are essentially the three baskets of the Buddha's teachings. There's the Vinaya, which is the morality. There's the Sutra basket, which is the concentration. There's the Abhidharma, which is the wisdom. But essentially, if you take the Eightfold Path, you can divide those eight into these three higher trainings. You have the right action, right speech, and right livelihood as our morality. You have the right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration as the concentration. And then you have the right view and right view and intention, that as being the wisdom. And again, that's when Tibetan Buddhism looks at the Eightfold Path, that's how they classify it and how they kind of fit it into there. And everything that is taught within the Lamrim falls into one of those categories, essentially. And if we look at like the three levels, we see the first level is really primarily morality, really helping us to understand the rationale for practicing good morality, because we need to have control over our rebirths and what have you. So therefore, we need to engage in right action and right speech and have right livelihood. It's not talked about maybe as much, right, livelihood as the others. Then when we get to the introduction of concentration and wisdom, we usually talk about them happening at that third level, but they are part of the second level of the Lamrim, where we understand the three higher trainings and the necessity of having deep concentration through right effort, right mindfulness, and then of course right concentration itself, that will allow us to penetrate into the nature reality, even to attain liberation. So wisdom is also there, because we need that wisdom. But nonetheless, we talk about concentration and wisdom, those higher trainings in the context of the bodhisattva trainings in the six perfections. So again, that's why we don't follow the exact same schema as the Eightfold Path, but the elements of it are implicit within those three higher trainings that are definitely a part of the Lamrim. So it would take a kind of a weird sort of Venn diagram to put them all together and show the intersections. But we would say there's nothing in the Eightfold Path, Eightfold Noble Path, that isn't included in the Lamrim. There might be some things in the Lamrim that are not taught explicitly in the Eightfold Path, but are there maybe more implicitly. Again, because, and I don't want to generalize, but we can say the Pali tradition primarily came out of the tradition of those seeking individual liberation, seeking their own freedom from samsara. I can't speak to what it is now, because I think Buddhism has become so interconnected, and different people. I mean, you go to His Holiness the Dalai Lama's teachings, at least before, you'd see, like when I would go, I'd see all these Theravadan monks in there in the front rows, partaking of the teachings. Well, how do I know what a Theravadan monk is practicing, whether they're on the path to liberation, path to enlightenment, what have you? So I think that there's probably, again, a lot more intersection of these teachings over time than what there was in the initial dissemination of the teachings. The Eightfold Noble Path supporting the Pali tradition, and then the presentation that came to be known as the Lamrim, certainly supporting the Tibetan tradition. But nonetheless, I mean, what do the Zen Buddhists practice? I have no idea. I mean, in terms of what is their approach to the path, I'm not sure it's the Lam. I know it's not the Lamrim, but I'm not sure really what it is and what it mirrors after. So they're all kind of in the same ballpark. But this is also, again, speaking to why there exists these different Buddhist traditions, is because people have different inclinations. For some people, the Eightfold Path really speaks to them in that structure and how they go about, practicing and dedicating their lives to the Buddhist path. So I think they're all part and parcel of the same thing, if you will, just again, different presentations. But that, in a nutshell, is how they are included when we look at them from the Buddhist perspective of the Lamrim. So, we should probably conclude. If there are additional questions, was there one more comment? Anyone here or online? Let's go ahead and do our final prayers, and I'll hang out here a little bit if people did want to talk about this. But keep in mind, again, November 19th is the date. We'll be starting this. We'll have breaks here and there, of course, with holidays and what have you. But the first course will run roughly till the end of February, and It'll be primarily here in person. There'll be one teaching at least where I won't be in person. I'll be in California because I've got to do a trip there. There might be small breaks sometimes between the parts of it, but I'm teaching it in 4 parts. I think we've got everything posted. Lou got everything out on the internet now, so you can find it out there at the website. Yes, is that true? I heard that from somebody. No, it's not out there yet. Okay, Lou will get it up there soon. You don't have to register now. The last thing I want to say though, before you do the dedication prayers, is to remind everybody that, not remind you, let you know, if you don't already, that the text for this that I would keep holding up, if you were going to get the hard copy, we are providing a 30% discount on the hard copy through Wisdom Publications, and I'll have information that I'll get to Venerable Dundrup on how to do that. If you get the ebook, in whatever format, Mobi or EPUB or whatever that one, the other one is, then you get the book for $9.95, which is really cheap. So I think with the discount of 30%, it's about $35 plus shipping. You will have to pay shipping from Wisdom Publications. They don't have a free shipping kind of thing or whatever. So, and if you want to order with others and get your books together, you can do that. But just know that that is offered by Wisdom Publications for people engaging in the basic program course. So if that's your case and you want to partake of the course, you can get the book through that means. And again, that'll be posted out there with the registration for the course. Let's do our dedication prayers. I don't know if we're going to have time to do all these because I've gone over a bit. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may we quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. Then the prayer for His Holiness's wishes to be fulfilled and for his good health and long life. Let's recite that, keeping in mind we're also creating the causes for all of our lamas who are here with us in this world, whoever they might be, to continue to be in our world with the same results: good health, long lives, an ability to benefit us and others. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. And since we're a bit over, I hate to cut out Rinpoche's swift return prayer, but let's just make strong thoughts of what we've done here. I mean, Rinpoche, he would emphasize the Lamrim so much. We're really fulfilling his wishes by just listening to teachings about the Lamrim, much less engaging in them. So think that we're dedicating for the quick identification of his reincarnation, for everything to be auspicious, for him to be back in this world in a form to benefit us and others. Also dedicating for all the beings that we're holding in our hearts, whoever they might be, those that we know, as well as those in parts of the world where there's great strife and suffering, so that they can be free from their suffering immediately and find all the causes that will lead them on the path to perfect happiness. And may all beings have these same results through our efforts here tonight. Again, thank you all so much. I enjoyed putting this together. Like I said, this is the first time I've done kind of a presentation on what the Lamrim's all about. I won't have to start the actual teachings with that, hopefully. But anyway, thank you for being here. And I'll hopefully see many of you again. I'll back in September for a Wednesday night, but certainly I'll hopefully see you in November for the course. But all right, everyone, be well. Thanks so much. Thank you, Sheila, for all your support online, everyone. Okay, bye-bye.